I should have known something was off the moment I drove into Ashridge. The road leading in was straight and narrow, lined with towering oak trees that seemed older than time itself. There, bare, twisted branches arched over the path like skeletal fingers, forming a kind of tunnel. Beyond the trees, the town appeared suddenly, nestled in a valley, as if it had been hiding from the world. I moved here for a fresh start. Life in the city had worn me down. Freelancing wasn't as glamorous as I'd once imagined, and the rising rent left me living paycheck to paycheck. When I stumbled on a listing for a fixer-upper cottage in Ashridge, the price was so absurdly low that I called the realtor without thinking twice. A quaint, peaceful town in the countryside? A place where I could finally focus on my art without the noise and chaos of the city. It sounded perfect. The first time I saw the town, it felt like stepping into a postcard. Every house was whitewashed and immaculate, with neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds that seemed to bloom in perfect harmony. The air smelled clean, almost sweet, and there was an eerie quiet. No honking cars, no distant hum of planes overhead. Just birdsong and the occasional rustle of leaves. It should have been idyllic, but something about it made me uneasy. The people matched the scenery. They were polite, overly polite, even. As I unloaded boxes from my car, a neighbor across the street, a middle-aged woman with a serene smile and a perfectly pressed beige dress, waved at me. "Welcome to Ashridge," she said, her voice light and pleasant. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." I smiled and thanked her, but before I could introduce myself, she turned and disappeared inside her house. It was like that with everyone I met. They were kind, yes, but their interactions felt rehearsed, like they were reading from a script. It wasn't until the third day that I noticed something peculiar. I was unpacking in the morning when I decided to take a stroll through the town. The streets were impeccably clean, the kind of clean you only see in those pre-war black and white photos where everything looks frozen in time. And as I passed by more people on the sidewalks, in their yards, at the small grocery store, I realized something. Not a single person wore red. At first, it was just an odd observation. Everyone I saw was dressed in muted tones: gray, beige, navy, or white. I didn't think much of it until I stopped at the town's boutique to pick up some essentials. The racks were lined with blouses, jackets, and scarves in pastel blues and pale yellows, but there wasn't a single item in red or even close to red. I chuckled to myself. Maybe Ashridge had some unspoken rule about avoiding bold colors. It was strange, but hey, I'd seen weirder trends. When I brought it up to another neighbor, the response only deepened my curiosity. It was Mrs. Feldman this time, the woman next door. She'd come over to introduce herself properly, bringing me a small basket of cookies wrapped in pale blue ribbon. "By the way," I asked casually, gesturing at her light gray cardigan, "is there a reason no one wears red around here? Or is it just a coincidence?" Her face froze for just a moment, her pleasant smile faltering before she quickly recovered. "Oh, it's just not a color people here wear," she said, her tone dismissive. "You'll see, it's nothing to worry about." She handed me the basket and walked off before I could press further. That night, as I sat in my half-furnished living room, I thought about her response. It wasn't just vague, it was deliberate. Whatever the reason was, she didn't want to talk about it. And that only made me want to know more. The curiosity lingered, gnawing at me like a mosquito bite I couldn't reach. I decided to test the waters. The next morning, I walked into the local general store and picked out a bright red scarf from my suitcase, a favorite of mine, and draped it casually around my neck. It was warm and soft, with little threads of gold woven into the fabric. A cheerful accessory, I thought. Something to liven up the muted tones of Ashridge. The store was small, packed with shelves of neatly stacked goods, jars of homemade preserves, locally grown produce, and rows of canned soup that looked like they hadn't changed their labels in decades. As I stepped up to the counter with a loaf of bread and a carton of milk, I noticed the clerk, a wiry man with thick glasses, staring at my scarf. No, not staring. Glaring. His eyes darted from the scarf to my face, then back again, his expression tight. He rang up my purchases in silence, his fingers trembling slightly as he handed me the change. Lovely weather today, I said, trying to break the awkwardness. He didn't respond. His lips pressed into a thin line as he avoided my gaze entirely. I walked out of the store feeling like I'd committed some terrible faux pas. The reactions didn't stop there. Walking back home, I passed the same middle-aged woman from across the street. She was trimming her hedges, humming a light tune under her breath. When she looked up and saw the scarf, the shears slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground. She quickly composed herself, but her face had gone pale. She didn't wave this time. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. It's just a scarf, I thought. What's the big deal? But the unease followed me all day. By evening, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, the real strangeness began. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint scratching noise at the window. It was soft at first, like a twig brushing against the glass. But then it grew louder, more insistent. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I froze, my heart racing. My bedroom window faced the backyard, where a dense thicket of trees bordered the property. I hadn't seen any branches close enough to reach the glass. Slowly, I sat up and peered toward the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the room, but I couldn't see anything outside. The scratching stopped. Probably just an animal, I whispered to myself. I didn't entirely believe it, but it was enough to get me to lie back down. Moments later, a whisper cut through the silence. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like wind, slipping through a crack in the wall. It wasn't the wind. The sound was rhythmic, a soft, breathy cadence of words I couldn't make out. My skin prickled as I strained to listen. The whispering seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the house itself was speaking. I bolted upright, grabbed the red scarf from where I'd draped it over a chair, and stuffed it into the closet. The whispers stopped immediately. The silence that followed was suffocating. The next morning, I found the scarf on my doorstep. It was shredded, the fabric torn as if by claws. Worse, the ends were stiff with something dark and crusty dried blood, though I told myself it couldn't be. My stomach churned as I stared at the ruined scarf. I didn't remember putting it outside. Shaken, I carried it to the trash can and buried it under a pile of yesterday's leftovers. As I turned back toward the house, I saw Mrs. Feldman watching me from her front porch. Her expression was grim, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She didn't say a word. Later that day, she came over. Her usual basket of cookies was conspicuously absent. I noticed you've been adjusting to life here, she said carefully, standing on my porch. She glanced past me, into the house, her eyes lingering as though she was looking for something. How are you finding Ashridge? It's nice, I replied, trying to sound normal. Quiet, though. I've noticed people here seem particular about some things. Her lips twitched into a tight smile. We're a close-knit community. We value harmony, she paused, her gaze darting to the trash bin near the driveway. It's best to avoid red, you know. For your own good. I opened my mouth to ask why, but she raised a hand to stop me. Some things are better left alone, she said, her voice sharp. Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, more confused and unsettled than ever. It was no longer just a quaint quirk. Something about this town didn't add up, and I was determined to figure out what it was. I couldn't shake Mrs. Feldman's words. For your own good, it was a warning, plain and simple. But for what? No one had given me a straight answer, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It was my life, my house, and I wasn't about to let some bizarre small-town superstition dictate what I could or couldn't do. So, the next day, I decided to push back just a little. I didn't have much red clothing, but I Found an old crimson sweater stuffed in the back of my dresser and pulled it on. As I stepped outside, I felt a strange rush of defiance. Let them stare, I thought. Let them clutch their pearls. And stare they did. At first, the reaction was subtle. Neighbors watering their lawns paused, their hoses dribbling onto the grass as they gawked. An elderly man walking his dog on the other side of the street made a sharp turn, heading in the opposite direction without so much as a nod. The cheerful little boy who usually rode his bike around the block froze when he saw me, his face turning white, before he pedaled furiously back to his house. By the time I reached the town square, I was practically radiating discomfort. Conversations stopped as I passed. People turned away or muttered to each other under their breath. The kind of hostility that usually simmers quietly in small towns was on full display now, and I was the target. The tipping point came at the cafe. I decided to grab a coffee and sit outside for a while, hoping to sketch the quaint buildings and cobblestone streets. As I approached the counter, the barista, a young woman with a braid draped over one shoulder, greeted me with a forced smile. But when I stepped closer, her eyes flicked to the red sweater, and the color drained from her face. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a whisper. "You shouldn't wear that." I frowned. "It's just a sweater." "It's not just a sweater." Her hands trembled as she reached for the register. "Please, take it off. You don't know what you're doing." Before I could ask what she meant, a shadow fell over the counter. I turned to see a middle-aged man in a dark suit, stiff, formal, and utterly out of place in the cozy cafe. His eyes were cold, his jaw tight. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice clipped. The barista hesitated, her gaze flicking between us. "No, Mr. Grayson, no problem." He nodded curtly, and then looked at me. His stare was sharp enough to cut glass. "Enjoy your coffee." I didn't stick around to drink it. That night, the noises came back. I'd spent most of the day replaying the cafe incident in my mind, my frustration mixing with a growing sense of unease. By the time I went to bed, I was exhausted. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the scratching began again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was louder this time, accompanied by faint tapping like fingernails on glass. My pulse quickened as I sat up, my eyes darting to the window. Once again, there was nothing there. Then came the whispers. They were clearer now, though I still couldn't make out the words. They rose and fell like a chant, an otherworldly cadence that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I clutched the blanket, my skin prickling with cold sweat. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, just as I began to think I'd imagined it all, I heard the floorboards creak inside the house. I scrambled for the light, my fingers fumbling with the switch. The warm glow of the lamp flooded the room, chasing away the shadows, but the fear lingered. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy book, and crept toward the bedroom door, my ears straining for any sound. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, heavier. That's when I saw a faint smear of red on the floorboards, leading from the window to the front door. My breath hitched as I knelt down, running my fingers over the stain. It was fresh, sticky, and then I saw the door. The previously white front door was now streaked with uneven, jagged lines of red paint, or something that looked like paint. It dripped down the wood in unsettling patterns, almost like symbols. I had painted nothing, and I knew no one else could have gotten in. As I stood there, staring at the ruined door, a single thought took root in my mind, as sharp and clear as a knife. Clear as a knife. This isn't about the color. It's about what it brings. The next morning, I called the police. 2 officers arrived, their faces carefully neutral as I explained the situation. They looked around, took some notes, and politely suggested that I might have been the victim of a prank. But when I showed them the red streaks on the door, their expressions shifted. They exchanged a glance, one I couldn't quite decipher. "We'll file a report," one of them said. "In the meantime, You might want to consider replacing the door. And he hesitated, his gaze lingering on me. Maybe keep things neutral, just until things settle down. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. That evening, Mrs. Feldman came by again. She didn't knock, just appeared on my porch like a specter. Her face was pale, her eyes dark with worry. I told you to get rid of the red things, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You've drawn their attention. Whose attention, I demanded. What's going on in this town? She opened her mouth to speak but stopped, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The setting. Sun cast long shadows across the street, and for a moment it looked like something was moving. In them. Something tall, thin, and wrong. They don't like being seen, she murmured. Then she turned and hurried back to her house, leaving me with more questions than answers. Whatever was happening in Ashridge, it was bigger than me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out who or what they were. After Mrs. Feldman's cryptic warning, I tried to shake off the fear that had settled into my chest, like a stone. But the truth was, I wasn't just scared, I was furious. Everyone in Ashridge seemed to know something I didn't, yet they refused to give me answers. I couldn't stand the idea of tiptoeing around whatever they were. If no one would tell me what was happening, I'd find out on my own. I spent the next day at the town library, a quaint little building tucked away on the edge of the square. It smelled of dust and old paper, its shelves lined with books that looked untouched for decades. The librarian, a frail woman named Miss Hargrove, greeted me with a polite nod, but her eyes lingered on me longer than I liked. I'm looking for information about Ashridge, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Its history. Do you have anything like that? She hesitated, her fingers twitching as they rested on the counter. What kind of history? Anything old, I said, leaning forward. Folklore, maybe? Traditions. Her mouth tightened. You won't find much written about that, she said finally. But you might want to look in the archives. Back corner. Her gaze flicked toward the scarf I'd tied loosely around my bag. It wasn't red, it was a muted green, but her expression suggested she still didn't trust me. The archives were dimly lit and cramped, the shelves sagging under the weight of ancient tomes and yellowed papers. I dug through box after box, finding nothing but land records, tax, documents, and grainy black and white photos of old town gatherings. But then, buried beneath a stack of brittle newspapers, I found something that made my skin crawl. It was a photograph from the town's centennial celebration, dated decades ago. The image showed a crowd of townsfolk gathered in front of the church, their faces alight with joy. But one figure stood out, a woman in a vivid red dress, standing at the edge of the group. Her face was turned slightly toward the camera, but it was blurred, too blurred to make out any features, even though everyone else in the photo was perfectly clear. I flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in spidery handwriting were 3 words: the Scarlet One. When I showed the photo to Miss Hargrove, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She snatched it from my hands, her face pale. Where did you find this? She hissed, her voice trembling. In the archives, I said, startled. What does it mean? Who's the Scarlet One? Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she turned away, clutching the photo like it might burn her fingers. You shouldn't have seen this, she whispered. You need to leave it alone. I reached out, grabbing her arm. Please, I said, my voice cracking. Just tell me what's going on. Who or what is the Scarlet One? Miss Hargrove didn't answer. Instead, she shoved the photo into her cardigan pocket and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blurred woman in the red dress. Couldn't explain it, but something about her filled me with a bone-deep dread, as if her image carried a weight far heavier than ink and paper. The whispers started again around midnight. This time they were clearer, the words threading through my mind like a song I couldn't escape. It wasn't supposed to stay. It wasn't supposed to stay. The air in the room grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and for the first time I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows by the window, something long and thin, like fingers. slid out of view before I could fully process what I was seeing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went back to the library, determined to press Miss Hargrove for answers. But when I arrived, the library was closed. A hastily scrawled sign on the door read, "Closed. Sorry until further notice." Looking for something, a voice behind me said. I turned to see the man from the cafe, the one in the dark suit. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but his eyes burned with intensity. "You've been asking questions," he said, stepping closer. "Questions that don't need answers." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "I just want to understand. What's wrong with this town?" His lips curled into a humorless smile. "Ashridge is fine, so long as its rules are followed. Outsiders like you always think you can change things, but you can't. You don't know what you're dealing with." "Don't." "Then tell me," I said, my voice rising. "Why is everyone so afraid of red?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because red is the only color it can see." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He didn't wait for my response, walking away with a sharp, purposeful stride. I stood there, the weight of his words sinking in. It, not a person. Not a group. A thing. Something ancient. Something monstrous. Something that had been watching me since the moment I set foot in Ashridge. The man's words haunted me. Red is the only color it can see. I couldn't let them go, even as the cold weight of dread pressed harder on me with every passing moment. Something in Ashridge, something was responding to the color red, and it wasn't just the people. It was something else. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or monsters, but this was different. Whatever the scarlet one was, it wasn't bound by the natural world. It wasn't human. I was tired of the fear, the whispers, the endless paranoia. If they thought red was dangerous, I wanted to know why. I needed answers. That evening, I grabbed an old can of bright red paint I'd found in the shed out back. Something the previous owner had left behind, and painted my front door a bold, defiant crimson. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was angry, reckless. But with every stroke of the brush, I felt a strange satisfaction, as if I was breaking a chain that had been wrapped around my throat since I arrived. By the time the sun set, the door gleamed like freshly spilled blood. The reaction from the townsfolk was immediate. The next morning, a group of them stood across the street, their faces grim and pale as they stared at my house. No one approached, but the intensity of their gaze sent chills down my spine. Mrs. Feldman was among them, her expression unreadable. As the day wore on, the unease grew. Shadows seemed to cling to the edges of my property. Even in the harsh light of the afternoon, the air itself felt heavier, thick with a sense of impending doom. That night, the real terror began. It started with a low hum, so faint I almost mistook it for the sound of the wind. But it grew, louder, deeper, resonating through the walls like a heartbeat. The shadows around the house thickened, merging into something almost solid. From my bedroom window, I saw them, gathering at the edge of the woods, tall, thin shapes with impossibly long limbs, their heads tilting unnaturally, as if sniffing the air. The hum deepened, and then I heard the whispering. It was all around me now, an incomprehensible chant that made my ears ache and my chest tighten. They had come. One of the shapes broke away from the others, moving toward the house with a deliberate, predatory grace. Its outline was indistinct, like smoke given form, but its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed faintly. It stopped in front of the red door, tilting its head as if studying it, and then it began to scratch. The sound was unbearable, deep, grating, the sound of something sharp carving into wood. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. Instead, I crept to the door, heart pounding, and peeked through the peephole. On the other side was nothing, just the red paint, unmarred. But I could still hear it, the scratching, the humming, the whispers. I stepped back, and a single word echoed through the house, clear and cold. Ein. The door cracked. When dawn broke, the door was ruined. The once pristine red paint was streaked with blackened marks, like claw marks burned into the wood. The symbols were strange and alien, shapes that seemed to twist and writhe even as I stared at them. The air outside was silent. Too silent. Not a single bird chirped, not a single branch swayed in the breeze. I could feel it, whatever I had done. It had changed something fundamental about the town. Around noon, a group of townsfolk arrived, led by the man in the suit from the cafe. Introduced himself as Mr. Grayson, the mayor, though there was nothing warm or welcoming about his presence. Mrs. Feldman stood behind him, her face tight with worry. "You've gone too far," Grayson said, his voice hard. "The door. The paint. You've drawn it fully into our world now." "What is it?" I demanded, stepping onto the porch. "Why won't anyone tell me the truth?" "The Scarlet One," he said, his voice dropping. "It was never supposed to stay. Long ago, the people of Ashridge made a pact to banish Red, and it would remain beyond the veil. But you've brought it back." His words sent a chill through me. "It's just a superstition," I said weakly, though even I didn't believe it anymore. Grayson shook his head. "You don't understand. It doesn't just come for you. It comes for all of us." The townsfolk turned on me after that. They stopped speaking to me, even looking at me. When I walked through the streets, they crossed to the other side or closed their doors. The isolation was suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something about the Scarlet One held me in place, like a magnet I couldn't resist. The events escalated. The whispers turned into screams at night, distant and otherworldly. Shadows gathered in the corners of my house, shapes that vanished when I turned on the lights. The door was the worst. The claw marks deepened each day, as if something was trying to break through, and then it did. One night, the house grew unnaturally cold. My breath fogged in front of me, and every hair on my body stood on end. The scratching at the door became pounding, and then a splintering crack. I ran to the front hall, but I was too late. The door had been pushed inward, hanging off its hinges, the clawed symbols glowing faintly in the dark. And standing in the doorway was it, the Scarlet One. It was tall and emaciated, draped in tattered crimson robes that moved as if alive. Its face was shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, hungry, ancient, malevolent. Tendrils of dark red. Smoke seeped from its body, curling toward me like fingers. It spoke, its voice a deep, guttural rasp. "You have called me. You will serve." The words sent a jolt of icy terror through me. I turned and ran, the sound of its laughter echoing through the house. I didn't stop running until I reached the woods. The Scarlet One's laughter echoed in my ears. But the night was otherwise eerily silent. I could feel it behind me, the oppressive weight of its presence pressing down on me like an invisible hand. As I stumbled deeper into the trees, the whispers returned. They weren't coming from the Scarlet One this time, but from the woods themselves. They grew louder, forming a haunting chant that seemed to guide my steps. I wasn't in control anymore. Something was pulling me forward. The path twisted and turned in impossible ways, the trees closing in like prison bars. The air grew colder with every step, and the shadows around me deepened until I could barely see. Finally, I emerged into a clearing. The moonlight revealed a massive stone altar, slick with something dark and wet. Carved into the surface were the same jagged symbols that had appeared on my door. The whispers stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. And then I saw it. The Scarlet One stood at the edge of the clearing, its tattered robes billowing as if caught in an unfelt wind. Its form seemed larger now, more distinct, the red tendrils emanating from its body, writhing like snakes. It raised a hand, or what passed for one, and pointed at me. "You have broken the pact," it said, its voice like the grinding of stone. "You will take their place." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The entity's tendrils slithered toward me, wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me closer to the altar. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and my vision blurred as the Scarlet One's face, if it had a face, loomed over me. As the tendrils tightened, images flooded my mind: the founding of Ashridge, its settlers striking. A desperate bargain with the Scarlet One. The town had been on the brink of ruin, plagued by disease, famine, and violence. In exchange for peace and prosperity, the entity had demanded a single thing that read, "The color of life and death be erased from the town entirely." The pact worked. The town thrived. But there was a catch: the Scarlet One still lingered, watching, waiting for the day when someone would break the rules. Someone like me. "You chose this," the entity hissed. "You brought me here. Now, you will remain, and I will feed." The tendrils began to tighten around my throat, the world dimming. But as the Scarlet One leaned closer, something inside me snapped. If it wanted me to take the town's place, I wouldn't go quietly. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a small utility knife I'd grabbed in my panic. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I slashed at the nearest tendril. The blade cut through, and the entity recoiled with an unearthly shriek. The tendrils loosened, and I stumbled back, gasping for air. The Scarlet One surged toward me, its rage palpable, but I was already moving. I grabbed one of the lanterns hanging near the altar. How it had gotten there, I didn't know, and hurled it at the stone. The glass shattered, and flames erupted, licking up the side of the altar. The symbols burned away, and the Scarlet One howled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The air grew impossibly cold, and then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The altar was gone, and so was the Scarlet One. I stumbled back to the house as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The front door hung open, the claw marks still etched into its surface. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I packed my things in a daze, barely aware of what I was doing. The town had won. Whatever had happened in that clearing, I knew it wasn't over. The Scarlet One wasn't gone, it had simply been pushed back, waiting for the next misstep. As I drove out of Ashridge, the townsfolk stood silently on their porches, watching me go. Their expressions weren't angry or relieved, just resigned. Mrs. Feldman was among them, her face lined with an emotion I couldn't place. Sadness, maybe, or guilt. I thought I'd escaped. I thought I was free. But the Scarlet One doesn't let go so easily. A week later, I noticed it again. A smear of red on my apartment wall, faint but unmistakable. Whisper in the night, too soft to understand but loud enough to freeze me in place. A shadow that didn't belong, flickering in the corner of my eye. It's still with me. I don't know if it's waiting for me to slip up again or if it's already won. All I know is that wherever I go, red seems to follow. The townsfolk said the Scarlet One couldn't leave Ashridge, but they were wrong. It's not bound by the town. It's bound by me. And now, no matter where I go, no matter what I do, it's watching, waiting. And one day, it will take me. Would you dare to defy the rules? Or would you have followed the town's traditions? Let us know in the comments or share your own eerie encounters with unexplainable rules.